The night was warm, but the palace was cold. In the upper chambers of a fortress built not for children, a small boy slept beneath silken sheets that smelled faintly of rosewater and iron. His breaths were shallow, uncertain, each one a fragile note in the symphony of a dynasty already collapsing under its own weight. Outside, the torches flickered against the marble walls, and footsteps, measured, deliberate, approached his door. The boy was a king, barely 9 years old, crowned not by destiny, but by convenience. Behind him lay a throne carved from centuries of blood and ambition. Before him, a future that his guardians would never let him see. History would remember his name, but not his voice. His reign would last only long enough for the grown men around him to whisper, to scheme, and finally, to decide that the easiest way to silence a crown was to still its breathing. When dawn came, the kingdom would awaken to mourn a tragedy disguised as mercy. The court poets would call it a peaceful death, but those who had heard the muffled cries knew better. This is the story of a child monarch, born into gold, buried in silence. If you're drawn to stories like this, tales where power devours innocence and history hides its cruelest truths, then stay with us. Subscribe, like, and follow for more real lives of the past, the ones history books tried to whisper away. The morning bells had not yet fallen silent when the boy was brought to the throne. Their echoes still trembled to the courtyards, drifting over the palace like the last breath of his dead father. Draped in gold-threaded mourning robes that dragged across the marble floor, he walked as if the air itself were watching him. Courtiers lined the walls, their faces arranged in solemn masks, each one bowing just deeply enough to conceal the hunger in their eyes. They called him Majesty now, though he barely understood what the word meant. He was small for his age, delicate in the way children of the court often were, pampered but pale, eyes wide and watchful. His tutors had once said he had the mind of a poet, not a ruler. He spoke softly, asked too many questions, and when he smiled, he did so without calculation, a habit that unsettled the men who measured power in silence. That morning, when the crown was lowered onto his head, he flinched. The metal was cold, heavier than he expected, and for a moment, he thought it might slide down and blind him completely. The regent standing beside him, a tall man with eyes like winter stone, noticed a tremor in his hands. He placed a steadying palm on the boy's shoulder, a gesture meant to reassure the court. But beneath that touch was the weight of possession. Outside, the people gathered in the square, chanting his name with the fervor of those who believe in symbols. They did not see the trembling child inside the grand hall. They saw only a continuation of divine order, the rebirth of a bloodline that had ruled for centuries. The boy's crown glimmered beneath the candlelight, like a promise heaven itself had sanctioned. Yet, in his heart, he felt no holiness, only fear. He looked toward his mother, veiled and silent at the edge of the chamber, her face unreadable beneath the fabric. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. She gave a small nod, not a comfort, but a surrender. She knew what the court did not. Her son's crown was not a gift, it was a shroud. He was too young to understand the intricacies of the Regency Council, but he could sense the fracture beneath their formal smiles. Every man who bowed to him also bowed to his own ambition. Every gesture of loyalty concealed a blade. At night, he would overhear whispers in the corridors, his name carried like a fragile secret. They spoke of him as if he were already gone, as though he existed only to justify their power. Sometimes he dreamed of his father, the late king, whose portrait still hung above the throne. In those dreams, his father spoke no words. He merely looked down upon him with eyes filled with warning. In the days that followed, the boy learned to sit still for hours, his back straight, his gaze unwavering, as decrees were read and matters of state discussed over his bowed head. The councilmen spoke over him, not to him, their sentences weaving a language of politics he did not yet understand. He was a symbol they needed, living proof that continuity had survived death. But inside, he felt himself fading, becoming less a person and more an emblem carved from silence. Each evening, as the candles were extinguished one by one, the palace seemed to breathe again, softly, resentfully. The boy would retreat to his chambers, where servants undressed him in silence, their eyes lowered. Only when the doors closed did he allow himself to whisper into the darkness, Father, am I meant to rule or merely to die?" No one answered. Only the soft of the night wind replied, seeping through the carved window frames like a ghost sigh. The first winter of his reign came early. Frost gathered in the palace courtyards, glittering like shattered glass beneath the dying sun. From his high window, the boy watched the servants sweep the stones clean, their breath rising in pale clouds. He envied them, their movement, their simplicity, their anonymity. They could walk freely. He could not. The corridors that had once been his playground were now forbidden paths, patrolled by guards who bowed to him but never let him wander. Every corner of the palace was watched. Every shadow whispered. At night, the boy's dreams began to change. He saw his father's throne room drenched in candlelight, the faces of the council hovering like ghosts in the flicker of flames. He would awaken with his heart pounding, convinced he heard footsteps outside his door. The palace nurse, an old woman who had once sung him to sleep, was replaced by a younger attendant he didn't know. Her hands were gentle, but her silence frightened him. He asked her once if she had known his father. She bowed and said nothing. That silence was worse than any lie. One morning, as he prepared for the ceremonial council meeting, he caught his reflection in a gilded mirror. The child who looked back at him was not one he recognized. His eyes seemed older, hollowed by sleeplessness, his small mouth tightened by restraint. The crown rested beside him on a cushion of crimson velvet. He stared at it for a long while, its jeweled surface throwing back cold fragments of light. When the regent entered, a man whose name the people shouted with reverence, he found the boy sitting perfectly still. "Your Majesty," the regent said, his tone polished and distant, "the council awaits." The boy looked up. "Do they await me or what I represent?" For a brief second, something flickered in the man's eyes, surprise, perhaps even pity. Then it vanished. "It is the same thing," he said softly. That day, as the council discussed war, taxes, and treaties, the boy realized he was invisible. His throne was higher than theirs, but his voice carried no weight. Every decision was made in his name, every decree sealed with his crest. Yet he was no more than a vessel through which others ruled. The regent's words filled the chamber, and the others nodded as though before an altar. In the stillness that followed, the boy's gaze drifted toward the windows. Beyond the glass, snow fell quietly upon the city roofs. He thought of the children out there, barefoot, nameless, free. The irony struck him like a cruel joke. He, the king, was the only prisoner in his own kingdom. Later that evening, his tutor found him reading by candlelight, an ancient chronicle of a forgotten dynasty. "You shouldn't tire your eyes, your majesty," the old man said gently. "I want to know how the kings before me ruled." The boy replied. "They ruled by fear," the tutor said, closing the book softly, "and they died by it." The boy said nothing. He only stared at the flame before him, watching how it bent and trembled in the smallest breath of air. For the first time, he understood how easily even light could be smothered. The council chamber smelled of old parchment, wine, and fear disguised as order. The boy sat upon his raised seat, the symbol of authority towering over a table crowded with men twice his age and none his kin. Their robes brushed the floor like shadows moving in slow unison, their words careful, tempered by calculation. He had learned to recognize the rhythm of deceit. The pauses too long, the compliments too sweet. It was here, in this room of whispers, that the kingdom's fate and his own would quietly unravel. The regent presided over the meeting, his voice the steady hum that guided every decision. His name echoed to the palace like a prayer and a warning. The people called him protector, savior, steward of the boy king's destiny. But behind the courtesies lay something colder, something ancient in its hunger. He had served the late king with devotion. Yes, but devotion to what? The crown or its power was no longer clear. The boy studied him, noting the way the man's hands lingered on the armrest, possessive, as if testing the texture of ownership. Outside, the wind moaned against the windows, carrying with it the faint tolling of church bells from the city below. It was a sound of worship and warning intertwined. The regent turned toward the boy, his voice as smooth as polished marble. "Your Majesty, we must discuss the northern rebellion. The lords grow restless. They must be reminded of their oaths." The boy nodded mechanically. He had learned that answers mattered less than obedience. "And how will you remind them?" he asked quietly. "With strength," the regent said. "With unity under your sacred name." The council murmured its approval. The words felt like chains disguised as silk. Sacred name. He knew now what that meant. They invoked him not as a ruler, but as a banner beneath which they could march. He was a symbol of legitimacy, the living proof that their violence was sanctioned by destiny. That night, when the council dispersed and the torches burned low, two of the regents remained behind. Their voices drifted through the corridors, measured, venomous, almost tender in their treachery. "He is too gentle," one said, too easily swayed by sentiment. "A child's heart has no place on a throne," the other replied. "The kingdom needs firmness. The boy's softness will destroy him, and us with him." And so, a long pause, followed by the whisper of a hand against a goblet. "So we guide his reign. Quietly. If necessary, we end it." The words hung in the air like smoke, thin, poisonous, and impossible to contain. Elsewhere, in the solitude of his chamber, the boy could not sleep. The palace had a sound at night unlike any he'd ever known before, a steady rhythm of footsteps, a distant creak of doors, a soft scrape of metal against stone. He sat by the window, knees drawn to his chest, and listened to the rhythm of conspiracy breathing through his walls. Somewhere deep inside, something within him began to harden. Not into anger, not yet, but into awareness. He began to understand that kingship was not bestowed. It was taken, guarded, and fought for. He had inherited the first of these, but the other two would never be allowed to him. And in that cold realization, childhood quietly died. Snow fell through the night, blanketing the palace roofs in a silence so pure it felt almost sacred. Yet within the high council chamber, purity had no place. The air was thick with candle smoke and quiet plotting. Beneath a ceiling painted with cherubs and saints, men bartered souls and swore false oaths, their breath clouding in the cold. The regent sat ahead of the long oak table, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes gleaming with the calm certainty of a man who had already decided the course of fate. "This boy cannot lead," he said at last, his tone neither cruel nor kind, merely factual. "And a kingdom without a leader is a feast for vultures. We must act before the lords move first." Around him, the other guardians nodded in solemn agreement. These were men who had sworn to protect the child king, who had once cradled him upon his father's death, calling him the light of the realm. Now they whisper of extinguishing that very light, justifying it as preservation. One called it mercy, another necessity, a third divine will. The regent said nothing further. He didn't need to. Power had already shifted in the silence that followed. At the far end of the chamber, a fire struggled on the hearth, its flames flickering weakly against the draught. The youngest of the councilmen, perhaps not yet fully corrupted, spoke hesitantly. If the boy were to vanish, how would the people be made to accept it? The regent turned to him, his expression unchanging. "The people believe what they are told to believe. They worship stability, not truth. We will give them a story worth mourning." A murmur passed through the group, a sound halfway between relief and fear. The decision, though not spoken outright, had been sealed. Meanwhile, the boy was kept unaware. Days passed in ritual monotony. Lessons with his tutors, brief audiences staged for appearances, carefully orchestrated processions to remind the people of their living monarch. He smiled when told to, waved when signaled, spoke when prompted. Each act felt rehearsed, detached from life. The courtiers praised his grace and composure, but behind every compliment, he heard the echo of pity. It was his nurse, one of the last loyal servants of his late father, who first noticed a shift in the air around him. She had seen too many courts to mistake calm for peace. One evening, as she combed his hair beside the fire, she whispered, "Majesty, beware those who speak too gently. Poison wears perfume in palaces." He looked up at her reflection in the mirror. "Do you think they mean to hurt me?" She hesitated. "I think," she said softly, "that some men mistake murder for duty." The next day, she was gone. No farewell, no dismissal. Only an empty chair where she once sat. The boy asked after her, but the servants avoided his gaze. She took ill, they said. She was sent away to rest. He wanted to believe them, But the lie was too clean. That night he did not sleep. He stood by the window as the snow fell, pale and endless, and thought of her warning. In the flicker of moonlight, he saw his own reflection superimposed upon the city below, a ghost of a king who had never truly lived. Far beneath him, in the shadowed corridors of the palace, the regent signed his name beneath a sealed decree. The wax hardened with a soft hiss, final and irreversible. It was not a command for execution, at least not yet. It was the beginning of disappearance. The kind that begins with isolation, continues with silence, and ends with a locked door. The pact was complete. The Guardians had done what history would never name outright. And in the quiet heart of the palace, a child unknowingly counted down the final days of his own reign. It began on a night too still for winter. No wind stirred the banners. No dogs barked in the courtyards. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Within the palace, the lamps burned lower than usual, their flames small and wavering, casting long shadows across corridors of forgotten laughter. The servants spoke in whispers, their eyes darting toward doors they dared not linger near. Something unseen had entered the halls, a presence colder than frost, heavier than dread. In his chamber, the boy sat awake. He had learned that silence was never empty. It carried meanings words could not. For days he had felt the world shrinking around him. Guards were placed, doors bolted earlier each evening, letters from distant allies withheld for his rest. Tonight, even his candle seemed reluctant to burn. He listened to the murmur of distant footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the lower floors. He rose, crossing the window. Outside, the gardens were blanketed in moonlight, silver and spectral. Somewhere out there, the fountain still trickled faintly, a sound that once comforted him. Now it only reminded him of how alive the world could be, how indifferent to what was about to lose. A soft knock sounded at the door. Once, twice. Not the pattern of a servant. The boy froze. "Who is it?" His voice was quiet, steady in defiance of pulse racing beneath it. "It is I, your majesty," came the answer, the regent's voice. Smooth, familiar, wrapped in false calm. "You need not be alarmed. There are matters that require your presence before dawn." The boy's breath caught. Something in the tone, not unkind, but too measured, filled him with an understanding he could not name, only feel. He hesitated, glancing at the small dagger his tutor had once given him for ceremony. Its edge gleamed, decorative rather than sharp. A child's weapon. He left it where it lay. The door opened before he could speak again. Two guards stepped inside, their faces hidden behind the half-masks of the royal sentinels. Between them stood the regent, his expression solemn, eyes heavy with what might have been sorrow or triumph. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing just slightly, "forgive the hour. There has been unrest in the city. For your safety, we must move you to a quieter place." The boy looked at him, searching for something human in the pale lines of his face. "Why tonight?" he asked. "Because the night," the regent replied softly, "keeps secrets the day cannot." The guards approached. Their hands were gentle, almost reverent, as they gestured toward the door. The boy stood motionless, then nodded. He had long ceased believing he could refuse. As they led him through the winding corridors, the palace that once seemed endless now felt like a labyrinth built for his disappearance. The torches sputtered, and with each corner they turned, the silence deepened. He realized then what his nurse had meant, that danger does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers your name in tones of duty. When they reached the end of the North Passage, the regent halted. A single door waited there, unmarked, unlit, ancient. The boy had never seen it before. Beyond it, a faint draft carried the scent of stone and dust. He looked up at the regent one last time. "Will I see my mother?" The regent did not answer. Somewhere deep within the palace, a clock began to chime the hour. Each toll rang like a warning swallowed by distance. And as the final chime faded, the door opened. The room beyond the door was small and cold, lit only by a single lantern swaying faintly from its chain. The air smelled of damp limestone and oil, an underground chamber, the kind built for safety during sieges or for secrecy during darker times. The boy hesitated at the threshold. The guards guided him forward, their gloved hands careful not to bruise, though the restraint in their touch felt worse than violence. He knew then, with a certainty that hollowed him from the inside, that he would not leave this place alive. The regent followed behind, his shadow long upon the stone floor. When the door closed, it did so without sound, as if even the wood had learned obedience. The boy turned to face him, his small frame outlined against the flickering light. "Is this my prison?" he asked, his voice low, calm, far too old for his years. The regent regarded him for a long moment before answering. "It is your peace," he said. "Peace." The word fell like ash. The boy almost laughed, but the sound would not come. He thought of his father's portrait, of his nurse's vanished hands, of the hollow faces of his council. For a fleeting moment, he felt pity, not for himself, but for them, men who could murder a child and still call it mercy. The guards stepped closer. They did not draw swords. They did not speak. One carried a length of white silk, fine and spotless, the same used to veil the faces of queens in mourning. The boy stared at it, his breath slowing. He understood now why the night was so still, why the candles in the halls had burned low. Everything had been arranged, rehearsed like a play whose ending could never change. He lifted his eyes to the regent. "Will they say I died gently?" The regent's face wavered in the lantern light, momentarily human. "They will say you died as a king." A tear welled in the boy's eye but did not fall. He straightened his back, his chin lifting slightly, the way his tutor had taught him for ceremonies. "Then let them remember me as one," he whispered. The guards moved, the silk unfurled, soft as breath. There was no scream, no struggle, only the quiet rustle of fabric, the muffled sound of a body meeting the floor, the faint hiss of the lantern's flame as it guttered in the draft. The regent stood still, eyes closed, his hand gripping the ring of keys at his side until his knuckles turned white. When it was over, the silence returned, thick, absolute. The boy's crown lay on the ground, its jewels catching the weak light. One of the guards bent to lift it, hesitated, then turned away. The regent reached out and picked it up himself, his reflection trembling in the metal. For a moment, he held it close to his chest, as though the weight of it burned. Then he spoke, almost to himself. "Forgive me." No one answered. By dawn, the room will be sealed, the bedding changed, the story rewritten. The official decree would announce a peaceful passing, an illness sudden and merciful. Bells would toll, priests would chant, and the kingdom would weep as ordered. But somewhere in the deep cold of the palace stones, the truth would remain, the echo of a child's final breath woven into the silence of the walls. And the veil that had covered his face would hang in the regent's chamber for years to come, untouched, unstained, a relic of a night the kingdom swore had never happened.